The air in the Grand Colosseum of Kthar Prime was thick with anticipation. The stadium stretched high above the ground, its massive obsidian walls reflecting the eerie blue light from the twin moons overhead. Thousands of Kthari spectators filled the arena, their bioluminescent eyes fixed on the lone figure standing in the middle of the blood-stained battlefield. A human. He was unarmed, his dark, battle-worn uniform torn in places, revealing cuts and bruises underneath. His wrists bore the marks of the energy shackles that had only just been removed. Yet, despite standing before an empire that viewed him as nothing more than an insect, he stood tall, his gaze unwavering. At the highest throne of the Colosseum, Queen Zelvora lounged with an amused smirk curling her lips. Her exoskeletal armor shimmered under the artificial lights, her golden eyes glowing with condescension. She had fought many wars, conquered many species, and seen countless creatures beg for mercy in this very arena. Humans, however, had always been nothing more than rumors, legends whispered among lesser civilizations. The idea that they were mighty warriors was laughable to her. This is what remains of the human strike force, she mused, her voice amplified across the stadium by the unseen speakers embedded in the walls. A single soldier? A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. The Kthari warriors, tall and imposing with their 4 muscular arms and chitin-plated bodies, watched in amusement. They had fought countless species, but no species had ever stood a chance in the Colosseum. The human did not speak. Zelvora's amusement grew. You do not beg for mercy. How quaint. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her clawed hand. Do you understand your fate, human? You will fight against my greatest warrior. Your species will be forgotten, and your corpse will serve as proof that humans were never a threat to the Kthari Empire. Still, the human said nothing. He merely tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the situation. The queen's smirk faltered for a brief moment. There was something unsettling about his silence. Unlike the others who had fought here before, he did not tremble. He did not plead. He did not curse her name. A flick of her wrist sent a command across the arena. The ground trembled as the massive iron gates opposite the human groaned open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. From within, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed, accompanied by the unmistakable scrape of metal against stone. The crowd erupted in cheers as the champion of the Kthari Empire stepped forward. Kavar. Nearly 8 feet tall, his exoskeleton was reinforced with obsidian-plated armor, covering his already imposing 4-armed frame. His lower 2 arms carried twin curved blades, each humming with an energy field sharp enough to cut through steel. His upper hands flexed into fists, powerful enough to crush bones. Kavar had never lost. The queen's voice echoed through the stadium once more. If you wish to pray to whatever gods your kind worship, do so now. The human exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. Kavar wasted no time. With a deafening roar, he lunged forward, his twin blades flashing in the arena lights. He moved with the speed of a predator, covering the distance between them in a heartbeat. The human sidestepped. Not a panicked scramble, not a desperate retreat, just a precise, calculated movement. The blade missed him by mere inches. The crowd gasped. Kavar snarled and swung again, this time with both blades. The human bent backward, the energy weapons slicing through the air just above his chest. His movements were impossibly fast for someone who had been a prisoner only hours ago. Queen Zelvora's smirk disappeared. Kavar unleashed a barrage of attacks, each strike aimed to maim or kill. The human weaved through them with a grace that seemed almost effortless. His eyes never left his opponent, studying, analyzing. Then, something changed. Kavar, frustrated by the human's evasiveness, lifted one of his lower arms in an attempt to grab him. The human reacted instantly, shifting his weight forward instead of retreating. He ducked under Kavar's grasp and slammed his elbow into the warrior's exposed ribcage. A sickening crack echoed through the arena. Kavar stumbled back, his forearms twitching in shock. The crowd fell silent. Zelvora leaned forward. Had she imagined that? The human stood still, his breathing steady. He did not celebrate. He did not taunt. He simply watched his opponent. Kavar growled in fury, now attacking recklessly. His massive hands swung toward the human, attempting to crush him. This time, the human did not dodge. He stepped into the attack. At the last moment, he twisted his body, narrowly avoiding Kavar's grip. In one swift motion, he grabbed a loose chain from the ground, one of the broken restraints left behind from previous fights. Before Kavar could react, the human looped it around his opponent's thick throat and pulled. Kavar thrashed, his arms flailing, trying to break free. His body convulsed as he struggled against the impossible strength holding him. Then, with a final, brutal twist, the human wrenched the chain tight. Kavar collapsed. The Colosseum was deathly silent. Zelvora stared, her mind racing. That should not have been possible. The human was unarmed, exhausted, weakened from imprisonment. And yet, he had just defeated her strongest warrior as if he had been nothing more than a training dummy. The human exhaled, dropping the chain. Slowly, he lifted his gaze toward her. For the first time since the battle began, he spoke. "You have no idea what's coming." Zelvora's claws dug into the armrest of her throne. Then, before she could react, the warning sirens blared. Something had arrived in Kthari space. And from the way the alarms screamed across the city, it was not friendly. The sirens wailed across the Colosseum, their shrill cry echoing through the towering walls. The crowd, which had been frozen in stunned silence moments ago, erupted into chaos. Kthari warriors shifted uneasily, their bioluminescent eyes darting toward the sky as the sound of distant explosions rumbled across the horizon. Queen Zelvora did not move. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the human who had just defeated Kavar, her greatest champion. "You," she said, her voice colder than before. "What have you done?" The human did not respond immediately. He stood still, his stance calm despite the growing panic around him. Then, as if addressing not just the queen but the entire empire, he spoke. "This isn't me. This is something much worse." A shiver ran through Zelvora's exoskeletal frame. There was no arrogance in his voice, no false bravado. Just certainty. Before she could question him further, a deep tremor shook the Colosseum. Dust and loose stones rained from the upper walls as the force of the impact rippled through the city. The sky above the arena darkened as massive Kthari warships mobilized, their sleek, black forms blocking out the twin moons. A commander rushed to the queen's throne, his plated armor scuffed from battle. "My queen, an unknown fleet has entered Kthari space." He hesitated, looking toward the human. "Speak," Zelvora commanded. "They came from the same sector where we captured the human fleet," the commander admitted. "But they are not human." A slow realization crept through her mind. How many ships? Too many. A second explosion rocked the city. This time, it was closer. The unmistakable sound of energy weapons discharging filled the air. The enemy had begun their attack. Zelvora stood, her golden armor gleaming under the flickering arena lights. Her empire had never been invaded. The Kthari were conquerors, not prey. Yet now, something had entered their domain, and she did not know its origin. Her gaze returned to the human. "What do you know?" For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He exhaled slowly. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." A dozen Kthari guards raised their weapons at him instantly. The human didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted his hand slightly, a gesture of surrender, not fear. "You have no idea what's coming, do you?" he continued, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. You thought you were fighting us. But we weren't the real threat. Zelvora stepped down from her throne, her four-clawed feet clinking against the stone floor. She studied him closely, searching for deceit, for weakness. What is out there? She demanded. The human glanced toward the night sky, where streaks of fire marked the descent of enemy craft. Something that neither of us are prepared for. Another explosion, this time so close that the Colosseum's western wall buckled. Screams filled the air as the spectators rushed toward the exits, pushing against one another in a desperate attempt to escape. The queen clenched her jaw. Enough riddles. She turned to her guards. Take him to the war chamber. If he has answers, we will extract them. The human smirked. You're going to need me more than you think. Zelvora ignored him. For now. The war chamber. The war chamber beneath the Colosseum was unlike anything the human had seen before. It was massive, built deep within the mountain city of Zektal, its walls lined with glowing control panels and holographic star maps. At the center of the chamber, a rotating three-dimensional projection displayed the unfolding battle above Kthari Prime. Zelvora entered, her presence commanding. The guards shoved the human forward, forcing him toward the projection. Explain, she ordered. The human studied the map. Red markers, enemy ships, were swarming the outer perimeter of the Kthari defenses. The blue markers, Kthari warships, were already taking losses. How many ships did you destroy when you attacked my fleet? He asked suddenly. Zelvora narrowed her eyes. What does that matter? The human exhaled. Because you triggered something far worse than you ever imagined. He stepped closer to the projection, pointing at a cluster of red markers moving with unnatural coordination. We weren't alone in that sector, he said. We were running. Hiding. Not from you, his eyes locked onto hers, but from them. A hush fell over the chamber. They call themselves the Veldrak, he continued. We don't know where they came from. We don't even know if they're alive in the way you and I understand. But they don't conquer like you do. They don't enslave. They don't negotiate. He let the words sink in. They consume. The chamber remained silent, but tension rippled through the air. The Kthari had faced countless enemies. They had crushed entire civilizations. But something in the human's voice sent a chill through the room. Zelvora folded her arms. And yet you still breathe. Why? The human's expression darkened. Because we were bait. The queen's mandibles twitched slightly. Explain. The human gestured toward the battlefield hologram. We knew they were coming. We sent distress signals, hoping someone, anyone, would intercept them. We figured if another empire showed up, maybe they'd become the next target instead of us. His voice dropped. Looks like it worked. A slow realization dawned upon the queen. You led them to us? The human turned toward her, his expression unreadable. We didn't mean to. But you didn't give us a choice when you attacked us first. The weight of the situation settled over the chamber. The Kthari had not just captured a human warrior, they had unknowingly placed themselves in the path of something far deadlier. One of Zelvora's commanders stepped forward. My queen, our fleet is being overwhelmed. We need to deploy ground forces before they reach the capital. The queen's claws flexed. Her empire had never retreated from battle. But this wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. Her golden eyes locked onto the human. You fought them before. How do we stop them? The human exhaled. We don't. A heavy silence filled the chamber. But, he added, we can survive. If you listen. Zelvora studied him for a long moment. For the first time, she was uncertain. Then the chamber shook violently as the first enemy dropships breached the lower atmosphere. The battle for Kthari Prime had begun. The war chamber trembled again, the vibrations rolling through the walls like distant thunder. Dust rained from the ceiling as another explosion ripped through the city above. The holographic battlefield map flickered, revealing a grim reality. Kthari defenses were collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. Queen Zelvora clenched her mandibles, her golden eyes narrowing as she analyzed the map. The human stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the display with the same grim expression. He had been right. The Veldrak weren't waging war. They were consuming everything in their path. "Your fleet is gone," the human said, his voice steady. "Your capital will fall within hours." One of her commanders, a broad-shouldered warrior named Kthaz, hissed in anger. "Lies. The Kthari have never been defeated." The human glanced at him. "That's about to change." The chamber doors burst open as a scout rushed in, panting heavily. His exoskeleton was scorched, his armor torn. "My queen! The Veldrak have landed. The outer districts are being overrun." A silence fell over the chamber. Zelvora's claws tightened into fists. The Kthari Empire had conquered dozens of worlds, enslaved countless species, and crushed every rebellion they had ever faced. Yet now, for the first time in their history, they stood on the brink of annihilation. She turned to the human. "You claim to have survived them before. Tell me how." The human exhaled, his gaze shifting from the battlefield display to the queen. "You should forget about winning. Focus on escaping." The room tensed. Escape? The Kthari did not run. They conquered. Kthaz growled, stepping forward. "Coward's words." The human didn't flinch. He locked eyes with Kthaz, his voice unwavering. "You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Kthaz lunged at him, claws bared. The human moved faster. In a blur of motion, he sidestepped, grabbed the warrior's wrist, and twisted. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as Kthaz collapsed to his knees, hissing in pain. Zelvora raised a hand, stopping her guards from interfering. She studied the human carefully. He had just overpowered one of her strongest warriors without breaking a sweat. "Enough," she said, her voice cold. "He is not the enemy." She turned back to the human. "If escape is our only option, where do we go?" The human released Kthaz and stepped back. "There's an old Kthari prison facility in the northern wastelands. You built it for species too dangerous to control. It has deep underground tunnels and its own power grid. If we get there, we can hold out long enough to figure out our next move." Zelvora frowned. "How do you know this?" A shadow passed over the human's face. "Because I was held there before you decided to parade me in your Colosseum." She hesitated. She had underestimated him from the start. That mistake had already cost them dearly. Another explosion rocked the city, and this time, the lights flickered. The palace was no longer safe. Zelvora made her decision. "We move now." The escape from the palace. The queen's elite warriors moved swiftly through the underground tunnels, guiding their ruler and the human through dimly lit passageways. Above them, the sounds of battle raged. The once proud city of Zektal was falling apart. Zelvora activated her communicator. "Report." A static-filled response came through. "The palace defenses are crumbling. The enemy, they do not fight like any force we have faced before. They are, inside the walls." Zelvora's blood chilled. The Veldrak had breached the inner defenses already? That should have been impossible. The human walked beside her, his expression unreadable. "They adapt," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "They learn your defenses, then overwhelm them." She didn't like how calm he was. "And yet, You still believe we can reach the wastelands? If we move fast enough, he replied. If we don't. A piercing screech echoed through the tunnels, cutting him off. The warriors froze. Zelvora's breath caught in her throat. The sound was unnatural, high-pitched, distorted, like metal scraping against bone. It didn't belong to any living thing she had ever encountered. The human's jaw tightened. They're here. The tunnels were supposed to be secure. How had the Veldrak already reached them? A warrior at the front raised his weapon, stepping cautiously forward. There is nothing he. A shadow moved. Something lunged from the darkness. The warrior barely had time to react before razor-sharp limbs pierced through his armor. His body convulsed as the creature lifted him off the ground, its twisted, insect-like form silhouetted against the flickering lights. A split second later, the Veldrak tore him in half. Zelvora's warriors opened fire. Bright blue plasma bolts illuminated the tunnel, striking the creature's chitinous hide. It shrieked, convulsing under the onslaught, but it didn't fall. The human grabbed Zelvora's wrist. Run. For the first time in her life, she obeyed. They sprinted through the tunnel as more screeches echoed behind them. The Veldrak were swarming. A warrior behind them cried out. Zelvora turned just in time to see him being pulled into the darkness. The human grabbed a fallen plasma rifle and fired a few shots behind them. Keep moving. The exit was close. Just a few more meters. A massive, clawed limb swung out of the shadows, aiming for Zelvora's head. The human shoved her aside. The attack missed by inches, slicing through the air where she had been standing. Without missing a beat, the human raised the plasma rifle and fired directly into the creature's face. The blast sent it screeching backward, its exoskeleton cracking from the impact. Zelvora stared at him, breathing heavily. You. She began, but he cut her off. Go. They burst through the exit, emerging into the open air. The wasteland stretched before them, an endless expanse of rocky terrain and storm-covered skies. Behind them, the tunnels collapsed as explosions ripped through the underground structure. Zelvora turned to her remaining warriors. Only 5 had made it out. Her empire was gone. Her people were dying. And the only hope she had left was standing beside her, a human warrior she had once mocked. The human exhaled, lowering the plasma rifle. This is only the beginning. Zelvora clenched her fists. For the first time, she wasn't laughing. The wind howled across the wastelands, carrying the scent of scorched metal and distant death. Zelvora stood at the edge of a jagged rock formation, golden eyes scanning the desolate landscape. The towering spires of her once mighty city were now distant smudges of smoke on the horizon. Kthari Prime had fallen. Behind her, the human adjusted the plasma rifle he had scavenged from a fallen warrior. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the landscape for movement. One of the surviving warriors, Kthaz, stepped forward, mandibles clicking in frustration. We are running like prey. This is not the Kthari way. The human exhaled. Then stop running. Stay here and die. Kthaz growled but said nothing. The truth was undeniable. Zelvora turned to the human. You led us here. Now tell me why. The human glanced at her, then pointed toward a distant canyon. There. The old prison facility. Your people built it for creatures they couldn't control. The walls are reinforced, the power grid is separate from the main city, and most importantly, he paused, his gaze darkening. The Veldrak haven't touched it. Yet. The queen narrowed her eyes. And you know this because. A humorless smirk crossed his face. Because I spent 2 years trying to escape from that place. The prison of the forgotten. The journey took hours. The terrain was unforgiving, and exhaustion crept into their bones. Kthari warriors, trained for urban warfare, struggled with the harsh wilderness. The human, however, moved with ease, as if he had traveled this path before. Zelvora watched him closely. He was unlike any species she had ever encountered. His kind were considered weak, insignificant. Yet here he was, guiding what remained of her elite warriors through a war-torn wasteland. "You're not just a warrior," she said, walking beside him. "What were you before all this?" The human's expression remained neutral. "A prisoner." She frowned. "And before that?" A pause. "A soldier." Zelvora studied him, sensing there was more to the story. But before she could press further, Kthaz called out. "There it is." The prison loomed ahead, a massive structure carved into the canyon walls. Towering barriers of dark metal stood untouched by time, and an eerie silence hung over the area. The human gestured for them to stop. "Something's wrong." Zelvora tensed. "What do you mean?" He pointed at the gates. "No bodies. No signs of battle. The Veldrak should have come through here, but they didn't." The queen's mandibles tightened. If the Veldrak had ignored this place, there had to be a reason. Still, they had no choice. "Move in," she commanded. Secrets beneath the surface. The air inside the prison was stale, thick with the scent of rust and forgotten suffering. The Kthari moved cautiously through the dark corridors, weapons drawn. The human led them deeper into the structure, his memory guiding them through the labyrinth of cells and observation decks. The place was abandoned, yet the power still hummed faintly through the walls. "Why did your people build this place?" he asked. Zelvora hesitated. "For prisoners too dangerous to control. Beings that even we feared." He glanced at her. "What happened to them?" She said nothing. They reached the central control room. The human activated the old systems, and the facility's main display flickered to life. Ancient logs, security footage, and containment data scrolled across the screens. Zelvora's heart clenched as she read the reports. Experiments. Torture. Genetic modifications. This place had been more than a prison. It had been a laboratory. Kthaz hissed. What is this?" The human didn't look surprised. "Your people were playing with fire." Before Zelvora could respond, an alert flashed across the screen. Containment breach detected. Lower levels compromised. A cold chill ran down her spine. The lower levels weren't empty. Something was still here. The survivors. A low, guttural sound echoed through the halls. Not Veldrak. Something else. The Kthari raised their weapons. The human motioned for silence. Then, movement. Shadows flickered at the edge of the dim lights. A figure emerged, a humanoid shape, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing, sunken eyes. Its voice was a rasping whisper. "You are not Veldrak." Zelvora stepped forward, her claws tensing. "Who are you?" The creature tilted its head. "We were prisoners." More figures emerged from the darkness. Different species, some barely recognizable. Some were grotesquely altered. The results of Kthari experiments. "You abandoned us," the first figure said. Kthaz aimed his weapon. "Stay back." The human stepped between them. "Easy." He turned to the prisoners. "We didn't come to fight." The leader of the creatures studied him. "You are not Kthari." "No," the human said. "I was a prisoner here, like you." A silence stretched between them. Then, the leader spoke. "The Veldrak are coming." Zelvora's heart pounded. "How do you know?" The creature's sunken eyes locked onto hers. "Because we called them." Betrayal in the dark. A moment of stunned silence. Zelvora's claws tightened. You what? The prisoner's expression remained unreadable. You left us to die in the dark. We were forgotten. But we learned. We adapted. And when the sky burned, we sent the signal. Kthaz snarled. You doomed us all. The leader's gaze remained steady. We made a choice. The same choice your people made when they built this place. Zelvora's blood ran cold. The Kthari had experimented on them, treated them as disposable. And now, their vengeance had arrived. The human stepped forward. If the Veldrak come here, they won't stop. They'll take you too. The leader's eyes flickered. Perhaps. A distant screech echoed through the halls. The Veldrak had found them. The human cursed. We need to move. Now. Zelvora turned to the prisoner leader. You know this facility better than anyone. Help us fight, and we all survive. The leader studied her for a long moment. Then, he nodded. The armory is 2 levels down. Follow me. As they ran, Zelvora glanced at the human. He had been right about everything. And now, their only chance at survival lay in the hands of those they had once abandoned. The alarms blared through the forgotten prison, their shrill wail echoing across the darkened corridors. Zelvora moved swiftly, her claws gripping the hilt of her plasma blade. Beside her, the human checked his rifle, his face calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. Behind them, the mutated prisoners followed in silence, their twisted forms moving with unnatural grace. Each had suffered under Kthari experiments, yet they had survived. Now, their fates were tied together. Kthaz growled. We are trusting them? Zelvora did not answer. The choice had been made. Ahead, the leader of the prisoners, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes, led the way. Armory is below. Weapons, explosives, if we are to fight, we must reach it. A distant screech sent a chill through the group. The Veldrak had entered the prison. The human muttered, then we'd better hurry. Descent into the depths. The group moved down the winding stairwells, the air thick with tension. The old prison groaned around them, its foundations weakened by time and neglect. Halfway down, the first attack came. A Kthari warrior barely had time to scream before something lunged from the shadows. A blur of chitin and razor-sharp limbs dragged him into the darkness. His weapon clattered to the ground. Zelvora snapped her plasma blade to life. They are inside. The human didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired into the shadows. The plasma bolts lit up the corridor, revealing nightmarish shapes lurking just beyond their reach. The Veldrak were hunting. Kthaz opened fire. The prisoners fought alongside them, their mutated bodies moving with terrifying speed. Some tore into the creatures with their bare hands, while others wielded makeshift weapons scavenged from the facility. The battle was short but brutal. The creatures fell, but not without cost. 2 more Kthari warriors were lost, their bodies torn apart. Zelvora clenched her fists. Every loss weakened them. The human reloaded. Keep moving. They pushed forward. The forgotten arsenal. The armory was sealed behind a reinforced blast door. The prisoner leader stepped forward. His long fingers tracing the control panel. The codes still work. Wait. Zelvora frowned. How do you know? The door hissed open. Inside, the armory stretched out before them, a massive chamber filled with Kthari technology. Plasma rifles, energy grenades, reinforced armor. Weapons of war, untouched for years. The human gave a low whistle. You people were ready for a war. Zelvora ignored him. Arm yourselves. The warriors moved quickly, securing what they could. The human grabbed a reinforced chest plate, strapping it over his battered uniform. He tested the weight of a heavy Kthari rifle before nodding in approval. Kthaz lifted a heavy plasma cannon. This will do. The prisoners gathered their own weapons, their sunken eyes gleaming. They had been victims once. Now, they would fight. A loud boom shook the facility. Dust rained from the ceiling. The Veldrak were breaching the lower levels. The prisoner leader turned to Zelvora. We have one advantage. She narrowed her eyes. What? He pointed to a massive console in the center of the room. This prison was built to contain monsters. The defenses are still active. If we can reach the control hub, we can turn this facility into a fortress. The human grinned. Then let's do it. The enemy arrives. The group moved out, weapons ready. The control hub was deep within the facility. If they could reach it, they had a chance. But the Veldrak had other plans. The first wave struck as they reached the central hall. Dozens of them poured through the broken walls, screeching and clawing. Zelvora slashed through the first creature, her blade cutting deep. The human moved beside her, firing shot after shot. The prisoners fought like demons, their unnatural strength matching the Veldrak blow for blow. Kthaz roared as he unleashed a blast from the plasma cannon, vaporizing a cluster of creatures in an explosion of green mist. But for every Veldrak they killed, more came. The human cursed. We can't hold them forever. Zelvora made a decision. Fall back to the control hub. They ran. The final stand begins. The control hub was a massive chamber lined with ancient terminals. The prisoner leader rushed to the main console, his fingers flying over the controls. Activating automated defenses, sealing lower levels. His voice was strained. This will slow them, but not stop them. Zelvora turned to the human. We need a final plan. He exhaled. We set traps. We hold this ground. We make them bleed. Kthaz grinned. A warrior's death, then? The human shook his head. No. A survivor's victory. They set explosives along the corridors. Plasma turrets roared to life, cutting down waves of Veldrak. The air filled with the sounds of battle. Then, silence. Zelvora's heart pounded. Did we? The walls shook. The largest Veldrak yet emerged from the darkness. A nightmare of shifting chitin and glowing eyes. The queen of the Veldrak had arrived. The human gripped his weapon. Well. Here we go. The air thickened with a suffocating silence as the Veldrak queen emerged from the shadows. Her massive form twisted, layers of chitin shifting as her glowing eyes locked onto the survivors. A deep, guttural growl vibrated through the control hub. Zelvora tightened her grip on her plasma blade. Kthaz steadied his massive cannon. The human, scarred, bloodied, and defiant, did not move. The queen exhaled, her breath thick with heat and decay. You are nothing. Her voice slithered into their minds, ancient and mocking. Zelvora bared her fangs. We shall see. The battle for survival had begun. The final clash. The Veldrak queen lunged, her razor limbs slicing through the air. The human moved first. His rifle let out a sharp whine as plasma bolts tore into her armored hide. Kthaz fired his cannon, a burst of raw energy slamming into her chest. The force sent her staggering, but she did not fall. Zelvora dashed forward, blade flashing in the dim light. Her strike cut deep into the queen's side. Black ichor splattered across the floor, sizzling on impact. The queen roared, her screech sending shockwaves through the chamber. She retaliated. A single swipe sent Kthaz crashing into the wall, his armor denting from the force. A spike of bone shot toward the human. He twisted just in time, the jagged edge scraping his side. Blood dripped, but he didn't stop. He never stopped. "Keep going," he barked. Zelvora dodged another strike, moving with the precision of a warrior bred for battle. But the queen was fast, too fast. Then, a second wave of Veldrak emerged. Dozens of them poured into the chamber, their claws clicking against the cold metal. The defenses had failed. The plan that could kill them all. The human's mind raced. Trapped, outnumbered, and barely holding on. He spotted something, the reactor core. A dangerous plan formed. A suicidal plan. "Zelvora! Kthaz," he shouted over the chaos. "Get clear." She slashed through a Veldrak's throat. "Explain, fast." "We overload the reactor." Kthaz groaned as he pushed himself up. "That's insanity. It's survival." The human's voice was steel. "This whole place is a death trap. Let's turn it into one for them." Zelvora hesitated. "If we trigger an overload, there will be no escape." The human smiled. "Then we make one. Detonating the end." The prison control systems were still active. The prisoner leader, barely alive, crawled toward the console. His fingers trembled as he input the final command. "Reactor, overload, initiated." The facility rumbled. Warning sirens screamed through the halls. The Veldrak queen's eyes flared. "You dare!" A thunderous explosion tore through the chamber. The queen shrieked as flames engulfed her lower limbs. The floor beneath them began to crack. Zelvora grabbed the human. "We need an exit." The human scanned the room. Then he saw it. A collapsed maintenance tunnel, barely wide enough. Their only chance. "That way," he pointed. Kthaz fired one last blast, keeping the queen at bay. The group sprinted. The walls collapsed behind them. The Veldrak screamed in rage, their voices swallowed by the firestorm. The human didn't look back. They reached the exit. Then, after the fire, silence. The cold air of the alien surface hit them like a wall. The prison was gone. The facility had collapsed in on itself, buried beneath rock and fire. The Veldrak queen was no more. Zelvora exhaled, her hands shaking. "We survived." Kthaz dropped his cannon. "Barely." The human just stood there. His eyes distant, taking in the destruction they had left behind. Zelvora turned to him. "Was this worth it?" He faced her. His expression unreadable. "We stopped them." His voice was tired. "That's all that matters." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Zelvora knelt before him. Her people, her kind, had mocked humanity. Called them weak. But standing before her, one lone warrior had proven them all wrong. "The Kthari owe you a debt," she said. "I owe you a debt." The human smirked. "You can start by getting me off this damn rock." Zelvora laughed. For the first time in her life, she understood. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was unstoppable. As the survivors disappeared into the horizon, a small movement flickered beneath the rubble. A single, glowing eye opened. The Veldrak were not finished.